The degrowth paradox, do we need to stop growing to survive, might sound like a radical and even dangerous idea, because for decades, economic growth has been seen as the ultimate goal of every country where rising GDP means more jobs, higher incomes, better living standards, and overall progress. But what if this same growth that has lifted billions of people out of poverty is also pushing the planet closer to its limits and creating long-term risks that could threaten future prosperity? Because modern economies are built on a simple principle: growth requires production. Production requires resources, and resources come from the environment. And for most of human history, this system worked because resources seemed abundant, and the impact of human activity was relatively small compared to the scale of the planet. But as industrialization accelerated and global population expanded, the demand for energy, materials, and land increased dramatically, leading to a situation where economic growth is now directly linked to environmental pressure, including climate change, resource depletion, and biodiversity loss. And this is where the concept of degrowth begins to emerge as a response to these challenges, proposing that instead of continuously expanding production and consumption, economies should focus on reducing their environmental impact, even if that means slowing or reversing GDP growth. And this idea challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions of modern economics: that growth is always good, and raises a critical question: can an economy function without growth? Because growth is not just a measure of progress, it is also deeply embedded in how economic systems operate. Governments rely on growth to generate tax revenue, businesses depend on it to increase profits and create jobs, and financial systems are structured around expectations of future expansion, which means that without growth, many of these systems could face significant stress. And this is why the idea of degrowth is often met with skepticism, because it seems to contradict the very foundation of economic stability. And yet, at the same time, the environmental constraints facing the world are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, as rising temperatures, extreme weather events, and resource scarcity highlight the limits of current growth models. And this creates a paradox where continuing to grow may lead to long-term instability, while slowing growth could create short-term economic challenges. And this tension between economic and environmental priorities is at the heart of the degrowth debate. And to understand it better, we need to look at how growth is measured, because GDP, which is the most commonly used indicator of economic performance, focuses on the total value of goods and services produced, but it does not account for environmental damage, resource depletion, or social well-being, which means that an economy can appear to be growing even while it is degrading the very systems that support it. And this limitation has led some economists to argue that growth, as currently measured, does not fully capture what truly matters for long-term prosperity, and that alternative measures, such as well-being, sustainability, and quality of life, should be considered alongside or even instead of GDP. And this shift in perspective is central to the idea of degrowth, which emphasizes reducing unnecessary consumption, improving efficiency, and prioritizing activities that enhance well-being without increasing environmental impact. And examples of this approach can include investing in renewable energy, promoting circular economies, where resources are reused and recycled, and encouraging lifestyles that focus more on quality than quantity. But implementing these changes on a large scale is complex because it requires coordination across governments, businesses, and individuals, as well as significant changes in behavior policies and economic structures. And this is where the debate becomes more practical, because even if the idea of reducing environmental impact is widely accepted, the question of how to do it without causing economic disruption remains unresolved. And this is particularly important for developing countries that are still in the process of industrialization and rely on growth to improve living standards and reduce poverty. And for these countries, limiting growth could slow progress and exacerbate inequality, which highlights the need for solutions that balance environmental sustainability with economic development. And this is why some economists advocate for the concept of green growth, which aims to decouple economic expansion from environmental impact by using technology, innovation, and policy to reduce emissions and resource use while continuing to grow the economy. And while this approach offers a potential middle ground, its effectiveness is still debated, as it depends on the ability to achieve significant efficiency gains and technological breakthroughs at a global scale. And this brings us back to the central question: is it possible to continue growing without damaging the planet, or do we need to fundamentally rethink the role of growth in our economies? And this is where the real story begins. But the real challenge of the degrowth paradox begins when we try to imagine what a world without constant economic growth would actually look like, because modern economies are not just designed to grow, they are dependent on growth for stability. And this is where the complexity becomes unavoidable, because if growth slows or stops, it does not simply freeze the economy in place. It can trigger a chain reaction that affects employment, incomes, government budgets, and financial systems, because businesses rely on expanding demand to generate profits and hire workers. And if demand stagnates, companies may reduce investment, cut jobs, or limit expansion, which can increase unemployment and reduce overall economic activity. And at the same time, governments depend heavily on tax revenues that are closely linked to economic growth, and without growth, tax income may stagnate while public spending needs continue to rise, especially in areas like healthcare, pensions, and social services, which can create fiscal pressure and force difficult policy choices. And this is why critics of degrowth argue that reducing growth without restructuring the entire economic system could lead to instability, recession, and declining living standards, and yet, at the same time, continuing on the current path of growth without addressing environmental limits may lead to even greater risks in the long term, including climate-related disruptions, resource shortages, and ecological damage that could undermine economic systems themselves. And this is what makes the paradox so difficult, because both paths carry risks and trade-offs, and there is no simple solution that avoids all negative outcomes. And this is why some economists and policymakers are exploring alternative models that attempt to balance growth with sustainability rather than choosing one over the other. And one of the most discussed approaches is the idea of redefining growth itself by shifting focus away from purely increasing output to improving efficiency, reducing waste, and enhancing well-being. Which means that instead of measuring success by how much an economy produces, it could be measured by how effectively it uses resources and how much it improves quality of life. Could involve policies that promote renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable infrastructure, and circular economic systems where products are designed to be reused.